Let's do it. Again, I am Wade Baker, one of the co-founders of the Scientia Institute. I'm very excited to share this research with you. Frank and I were just talking about before we went live here that this has been over a year now that we've been talking about doing this particular study. So it's nice that it's finally here and we get to share the results, and it will see the light of day. So speaking of Frank, you want to introduce yourself, Frank?
Absolutely. So Frank Duff, one of the co-founders of TidalCyber, who helped do this research with the Scientia Institute. So I come from MITRE before founding Tidal. It was all centered around attack, right? Attack evangelism, detection engineering, leading the attack evaluations program. And so very steeped in attack, really happy to help figure out ways that the community can better leverage attack. And I think what Wade and the team have been putting together here is one way that we can start helping the community understand how do I prioritize techniques? I can't do everything. So really excited to get this research out.
Appreciate it. Glad to be doing this with you. And speaking of Wade and team, I do want to recognize Carolyn Gimarelli helping us run this webinar, did a lot of the design work that you will see as we go through this. And John Sturgis did a lot of the analytical work, and both of them will be helping to keep up with Q&A. If you have questions, just drop them in there. We do have people that are familiar with the research waiting to answer those questions and that kind of thing. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with what we did, just so you know kind of what you're looking at in this. So we identified reports, public reports that were released in 2022 or early 2023. As I said, we started this last year, late last year. So we pulled kind of everybody's latest report, and our criteria was it had to have some kind of statistic on attack techniques that they observed. Now, if they were just talking about attack techniques, what they thought was most important, or giving kind of a description of techniques, those were not included. They had to have some type of here's what we observed. And we harvested all the tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques reported by each of those sources. And at that time, attack standardized was on version 12.1. And as you can imagine, not all sources were reporting, because these would have been, in many cases, data that they've collected over the previous year and then reported in 12.1. But some of them reported in earlier versions, and we kind of updated all of that and tried to get everybody on the same page. I think attack 14 was released pretty recently, but don't worry, this is not super out of date, because the number of changes have been pretty low in the last couple versions. So why we even bother doing all of this? Well, one, that's the nature of attack. I mean, you get together this framework to provide a common language and common classification measure with all these attack descriptions of adversary techniques, and more sources are using those and reporting what they see. So it provides a wonderful opportunity to try to synthesize and get a collective view of what's out there. And that was the challenge is, all right, all of this information is out there. Yes, I could take one source and just assume they're the source for everything, but as you'll see, that's not always the case. And we wanted to get that consensus view of what's really top. And furthermore, what do we mean by top? Can we even measure a top? Because they all see different things in different ways and measure it in different ways. So how do we synthesize that and derive what it means to be top? So we'll share a lot of this with you as we go through this webinar. Again, feel free to ask questions. We'll be trying to monitor for that. So let's start with coverage, right? This is all about just, if you think of all attack techniques and sub-techniques out there, what's been observed and reported on in some way. We're not even at frequency or which ones are top at this point. I just want to know what people are seeing. And I believe this was 12.1. This may have been 13 based on this, but regardless, 193 enterprise techniques are out there. That's what is possible to see when you look. If you could see every technique and attack, there's 193. Across all the 22 sources, we saw 123 techniques, right? So that means that 36% of techniques were never reported by any source. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were not observed, because some of these reports, some of these sources would only report their top 10 or top 20 or something like that, right? So it's possible that they saw them but didn't include them in their public report. But just take it at surface value that over a third of the techniques defined in attack were not mentioned in any of the reports that we used for this study. And if you kind of go down the pyramid, there were 45, or about a quarter, of techniques that had at least 5 sources reporting those. So, Frank, I don't know, did this surprise you? Does this kind of sink? I know you guys are all about the business of gathering and harvesting lots of reports from multiple sources, but did sort of distilling it down like this?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that come from this, and this is something that your team was very attuned to, was the fact that there's biases in sources, right? And understanding where's the vantage point coming from. So if, for instance, an EDR vendor is releasing their content in their top 10 list, they're doing it based on the things that they're seeing, what their sensors can see. And those are generally the things that they also want to amplify to show that, hey, our product's good, we've got visibility. So you get this a bias towards which techniques are being reported, and it might just be because that is where the visibility is, for good reason. But it's that I think is one of the key things that we always had to keep in the back of our mind as we're going through this, is just understanding that we need that diversity of sources, and we need more sources so that we can make the data. I mean, we were using as much as we could, but it's really important to understand that there just needs to be that broad source of information to really understand what true technique sightings are. So that was the first thing to come to mind. We'll get into this more. I think that the other key component is, like, there's also all the sub techniques, and we don't want to gloss over that. We fully recognize that.
Let's go there. In fact,
yeah, there you go. Yeah. So a lot more sub techniques, and like this it's just completely exasperated the problem right now. I mean, look at the number: 401 sub techniques and only 59. So this was the more stark thing to me, not to steal the thunder.
No, please.
This is exactly where I went into.
Yeah. This one was, not surprising, and there's a lot of issues here. Like, I kind of get why we're seeing this, and if you look at the chart, 401 sub techniques are defined, but 85% of those sub techniques were never reported by any of the 22 sources that we managed to collect for this study. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the sub techniques were not observed. And I think that's particularly important at the sub-technique level, because I'm certain that many of these sources may collect information at the sub-technique level, but they choose to report at the technique level and roll it up just to make it a little less cluttered, or it's kind of easier to convey. And I get why those decisions are made, but that kind of comes at the sacrifice of specificity that might be useful for analysts and defenders that would like to know those sub techniques. So it can be a little hard to know whether it just flat out wasn't collected, wasn't observed, or it's just a reporting level decision. So yeah, that was definitely a challenge in this research.
Yeah, and sub techniques, going back to that point, right? Specificity is really key. If you're talking about actionability of the intelligence that's out there, right? It's great to know that command and scripting interpreter is the most popular technique, but like, which way are they executing, right? How you're going to defend against WMI versus command shell versus PowerShell, those are very different things. And so it's helpful to understand which techniques are prevalent, but really sub techniques is where things seem to be specific. And you could say, okay, well, sub techniques are new, but
yeah,
right,
2020, I believe, right?
Yeah, but it's years old at this point. And so while that might have been the case if we had done the study 2 years ago, right, at this point, right? If you look at day-to-day reporting that's out there from the open source world, it does include sub-techniques. Yeah. So why don't these primary sources that are doing the rank stacking also included would be the question that I would have, especially considering that if we're really talking about truly usable information, we need to understand which sub-techniques are actually being leveraged.
Yep. I am going to anticipate a question here that some might be having of, hey, you keep mentioning these 22 sources. What are they? I don't actually have a list in this webinar, but we will send you a link to download the full report right after this. And those are all listed in the appendix. So that will be information that you have. It's not a dark secret or anything we're trying to keep. It's just a lot of text for for a webinar to include them all. What we did do in sources, just to give you a hint here, is we categorized all the sources as either a managed services provider, an incident response services source, some kind of telemetry, or open source intelligence. And I realize those 4 buckets might not be perfect. You might have some different ones, but the sources that we had seemed to fit pretty well into those. And as Frank mentioned, the source is very important to the comprehensiveness of visibility and the types of techniques that are seen. So we do a lot of source by source or source type by source type comparison in this report. And as you can see here, if I just ask the question of which types of sources are more broadly reporting techniques and sub-techniques, it's the MSSPs and the IR firms, and that kind of makes sense because in general, when you have some type of telemetry, there's a device and it has a specific purpose and it's collecting at a certain point in your stack and that kind of thing. So when you report what top 10 that you're seeing, it's not wrong, but it's probably not seeing the comprehensiveness from, attacker reconnaissance all the way through, the tactics. So whereas in MSSPs and incident responders, at least part of their job on a significant event is to collect all of those details and kind of build out the what happened in that scenario. So I think that sort of kind of naturally results in the fact that they are reporting on a broader set of techniques across the enterprise framework. So I just want to echo what's on the slide there. This isn't better or worse. These different sources are different, right? And you kind of, if you are trying to build a comprehensive picture of TTPs relevant to you, don't just rely on one, include multiple and understand where they have strengths and weaknesses and broad visibility and narrow visibility and all of those kinds of things, because that's important to maximizing your usefulness and value from things like this.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add for this one specifically is if you look at those top 2, managed service and incident response, it also points back to that first slide that we had, which was on that only certain techniques are really disclosed. And right, you've got to think in the context of those top 2 especially are going to be reporting on what is truly bad. And so they need to be able to filter out things and the noisier things potentially. And so it does go to, again, speak to understanding where the limitations or strengths are with some of these different sources in terms of that visibility.
Good point. Good point. Okay, so let's turn from sort of a coverage across attack to getting into specific techniques. I see a question here about sharing examples and what kind of sub-techniques or techniques did we see or didn't we see, and that's where we start to get into this in the next couple sections. So we make a distinction in the report between most reported and most frequent. And I realize that may be a weird distinction, but hopefully as we go through this and as you read the report, that distinction will be clear. Reporting is just, hey, we've got 22 sources. Which of the techniques are reported by more of those sources than others? And then on the other hand, on the frequency side, which we'll get into a little bit later, that is the sources that measure frequency, how often do we cite or detect these various techniques? Let's rank those in order and see which ones are high frequency and lower frequency. So slightly different things. Both can be considered top techniques. So let's dive into most reported, and we started at the tactic level. And you can see we broke this up across the tactics in attack, and then also across those source types that we listed earlier. And just a couple observations from me to kick this off. The sort of pre-attack stuff, it kind of has low reporting overall, right? Not many sources are seeing reconnaissance and resource development, or at least not reporting on it, right? And again, that makes sense, especially for things like telemetry, because telemetry is in your network usually. So it's not going to see stuff going on out there as attackers try to develop, their attack and command control infrastructure and all of those kinds of things. And you can see based on the heating that there are a larger number of sources that kind of have visibility or reporting on that initial access, execution, persistent, privilege escalation, et cetera, kind of the earlier phases. And then it kind of drops off as you get what attackers are doing inside the network, and then as they move on their goals to exfiltrate data or whatever that form of impact is. I realize that the attack framework does not proceed linearly like this, but in general, earlier phases, how they get in and how they escalate privileges, better visibility than lateral movement and what they're doing inside the network, which is intuitive to me.
And this does speak to a couple things, right? So there is, I don't know if it's so much a bias as much as just an understanding that host-based telemetry is one of those things that really is pivotal for attack coverage, as we would call it from a defensive perspective. And so what you also see here is strong numbers around things that would heavily leverage that host or that process information, host-based data, file-based data, versus some of the lesser seen ones are the things that are network, which are harder to sift through and just oftentimes under leveraged, frankly. And so I think you see some of those biases come up here from what attack was truly built on and how techniques are measured and where there's visibility, what the techniques are. And then one of the things that I'd also point out is while recon and resource development is definitely under reported, we have been seeing an uptick in terms of the number of defensive solutions that are trying to explore that space, especially around what they would call like the human attack surface, right? Like are your users' personal accounts exposed on the dark web, and what does that mean from your organizational standpoint, brand, reputation, things like that. So I think that you are seeing people trying to go into the left, and I think that that's where we have to again, as the CTI community, enable users to understand where are their opportunities. But if you're trying to look at from a defensive standpoint, just to talk about defensive coverage versus source coverage like we were talking about before, how am I going to defend? You just have to understand that there's less opportunities over there. And so that's maybe where you don't focus quite as hard, understanding you can do little bits and pieces here, but then you really should be focusing on some of these other aspects to ensure that you've got the right amount of defensive coverage.
So sticking with the theme of most reported, this is at the technique level. You see the familiar attack matrix view here is how we chose to show these. If a TID technique ID is listed, that means it was reported by at least one source, and the heat layer as the legend up above indicates, is the sort of hotter green means more sources reported that technique than others. And it's relative across the whole thing, so that I can tell, for instance, that T1055 under defense and evasion is hotter or reported by more sources than the first one under discovery, T1082. colors are kind of hard to read, so there's a consolidated top 10 right here in terms of most reported. These are the techniques reported by the most sources, just straight up numerical source reporting there. And again, you don't have to jot all these down and be furiously scribbling. We will send out the report and you'll have exactly this to go on if this interests you.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did do as well is there's links off so that you can see an entire matrix of this content, so you can explore. And if you don't know what T1091 is, no problem. You can access the full data and really explore the heat map that you see here in all its glory. I think one of the other things to note here is if you look at that top 10 list, you see that there's this clustering of valid accounts, for instance. We did try where possible to distinguish between them, because again, going back to how different sub techniques will be detected different way, different implementations of, in this case, valid accounts could potentially be detected in different ways. And so we did try to pull out tactics, but unfortunately, I think that that's another place where we saw that the data could use some improvement in terms of just that specificity. So if it didn't specify, we had to kind of like assume that it was just generally speaking, that this is how it's treated. So that's another place where I would have that call to the community of trying to better specify specifically what it was being used for versus just that valid accounts were being used.
Yep, totally agree with that one. That was definitely one of our challenges in comparing all of these. All right, this is an attempt to show how those most reported techniques differ across different types of sources. So the leftmost column here, you have the overall most reported techniques. And then the lines kind of show how that changes for telemetry, managed services, IR, and OSINT. So in general, I think there's some decent agreement here if you kind of consider what we're doing, taking very different types of sources and seeing which ones are most reported among them. A lot of these, like the top 3 overall, or the top 3 in a little bit different order in telemetry and managed services and in IR. But then you do see some pretty big shifts, like these lines, big drop here, or things that are unique to that particular source, like 1082. This is, I realize it's a lot to take in just as we're kind of casually talking about this, but I found this pretty interesting. And again, it's a constant reminder of, if you're relying on one source or one type of source, your view of what the top attack techniques are is going to be very much molded by that source, right? And you probably want to diversify those sources to get a more comprehensive, complete picture.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to kind of do. Why we keep harping on the different sources. And it's because, right, this is imagine taking this to your own organization, right? And you're trying to contextualize all this and say, what's my top 10, right? You could utilize some of the same methodology that the Scientia team has put together here and trying to understand, okay, where do I need to prioritize? But to do that, you need to be able to understand, how do I get information from this source or this source or this source? If I only have it from this, where do the biases exist? So I think it's really important to understand that we keep harping on this whole bias thing to try to understand that, okay, but that's because a lot of these organizations need to either leverage the multiple sources, or where they can't, at least understand how they might be biased based on what they're reading or seeing or being provided by their sources. And I would agree that it's really interesting. It's like, if you see that the top 3 is the top 3, right, for the most part, up until the OSINT side at least. And then you get, again, that same kind of density on the bottom. So you do see the general patterns that do kind of expose themselves here. So it is really interesting to see, and that diversity can help kind of fill in those blanks.
Let's do one more in the most reported category before moving on to frequency. This is a view of sub-techniques. Similar to the enterprise matrix, we have sub-techniques listed under the tactics where they reside. And over in the bottom left, you get the overall top 10 most reported sub-techniques. you can look into each of these and, hey, why is PowerShell number one? We can talk about that, but kind of at this level, we're really more interested in how we get here, right? Let's just try to get the view. And again, you can compare across techniques here and see that certain tactics have a lot of sub techniques in general. That is because there are a lot of sub techniques defined in those tactics. There are a couple exceptions. For instance, discovery doesn't have a lot of sub techniques that make the reported list, but I believe that has 13 sub techniques defined. So they are in the framework. They're just not, for whatever reason, being reported as much as some of these others. So we have a little bit of discussion around that in the report.
Yeah, and right, on one hand, something that discovery is a good example of, you could wipe it off as, well, it's discovery, right? I think generally people think that even if it were reported, it's not highly defensible. But that being said, right, there's things like discovery of the security software on your system, right? And those types of things are things that are perhaps better defensive points and should definitely be looked, because that's now making your systems potentially less secure if adversaries know what to avoid, right? And so I think there are definitely places where you have to kind of look to see, okay, well, in the absence of data, there's still things we need to do. And then the other part to kind of recognize is, just because it's the most reported also doesn't mean it's the best place for defense. And that's definitely something to keep in mind, right? I mean, execution is one of those grab bag techniques. It gets a lot of hits just because, right, to do anything, you need to execute. And so understanding that not all these techniques provide the same defensive quality or opportunity, I should say, is a really important aspect to keep in mind.
All right, let's turn here to the most frequent attack techniques. Again, this is if the source provided some sense of not just, hey, we saw that, yes or no, but some type of, here, that was X% of our detections, or some of them provided a ranking of how often they saw one compared to another. That's what we're trying to dig into here. Now, the biggest challenge in all of this is that, yes, we found 12 sources that reported percentages that looked like, hey, technique blah is X% of what we're seeing. But when you dig into that, in some cases, that's X% of our cases. In some cases, that's X% of the detections. Malware we detected, X% had that as a behavior of the malware, and any number of other things. So it's really, it was very obvious that we can't, for instance, just take this and average across the row and get, T1486 is the average of all of those percentages, that because it's apples and oranges, and maybe even worse than apples and, I don't know, something not even in the fruit category. So we weren't able to do that, but within each technique, what we can do is do a ranking. So that's the way we ended up going with this. Is we took, all right, if TE2, by the way, is the telemetry source number 2. Again, we list sources in the appendix of the report, but we can see which one that, however they measured it, this was most frequent or least frequent among the things that they reported. And we can do that with all of them and derive a ranking, and then compare rankings across sources. And that at least gets us into the apples to apples, or at least apples to oranges category. So we can kind of see which ones are on the top of the stack versus bottom. So when we do a process that's kind of like that, it was more elegant than what I just fumbled through, but it was something like that. You get a matrix that looks like this. This is the heating here is based on more frequent. In other words, those techniques were more frequently ranked as higher on the frequency tier across sources versus lower. So If you kind of roll back and compare this to the reporting, this one's a little more dark, and there are fewer bright spots. So that kind of, to me, indicates that the where all these sources are agreeing on what's more frequent, there's fewer of those kind of overlaps than there are just where are all these sources co-reporting. And, it's interesting. I don't know exactly what to make of that, honestly. Like, does that mean that those really are the most frequent ones and therefore we should prioritize them? But the fact that our goal was to measure this, to get that cohesive consensus view of frequency, and this was it. And there's the 10 most frequent techniques according to that frequency-based ranking approach that I briefly described.
Yeah, and I think some of the interesting things that you'll see the community do, I know that we're doing it, is kind of trying to overlay frequency versus the reported, and trying to understand where are those commonalities against it. Because if you look at, again, the most frequent, some of those are harder things to defend against. And by harder, I mean maybe noisier traditionally in environments. But still super important to figure out how you have visibility into. And when you get down to something, especially like that number 7, it's credential dumping, right? That is like surefire, right? Like, no, you really need those protections in place to do that. You need your maybe deceptive technology, whatever it might be, mitigations. But there's some interesting patterns that are kind of like emerging, especially as you look across some of these different data sets and how that data can be pieced together.
Yeah. And I mentioned that that matrix was sort of cooler looking overall than the reported angle. When we do this, we call them subway or worm charts. We showed you a version of this chart earlier that was based on reporting of techniques. This is the same thing based on the frequency, the ranked frequency of techniques. And there's just a lot less consensus here. We're given the overall top 10 most frequent. And then within each source, the gray ones are the ones that are not listed in the top 10 overall. So, you look at open source, its top 10, none of those are in the top 10 overall. And some of these are, they appear in 1 or 2. There's some big swings, all of which is, interesting and worth considering and thinking about if you are really trying to do kind of a prioritization based on frequency. I realize that many people are going to prioritize techniques first and foremost on the adversaries that they're concerned about and the techniques that they use. But let's just say you narrowed it down to your set of adversaries that are of concern and the techniques that they use. You could still apply the same principle here, and you're probably going to see something different, right? Different sources are going to give you different visibility and different frequencies into those techniques of interest, and kind of trying to synthesize those across is the challenge. And it was a fun part of this research, and there's a lot still, I think, left to look into in this kind of thing.
I think one of the other things to kind of look at is, even if you're not using it as prioritization, right? Validation on that you are looking at the right things. Right? How are you doing against any of these techniques? Because the list is longer here, right? If you're right in the lack of commonality, if you're to say, like, okay, well, I want to prioritize all the most frequent techniques just to make sure I'm covered, right? Okay, you could do that, but maybe the approach is a little bit different in terms of, all right, that'll let me go through and create something here and maybe it's more about being able to say, okay, well, is this on my list of things that I care about? And if so, how am I doing against it? Where does that fall? How does that fall against everything else? So I think even in the lack of data, there's still definitely ways that this can be a leverage. At the end of the day, I think being able to say that here's the most frequent does have a power, even if source by source, it's a very different thing. But again, sources are different for a reason. And that's kind of been something that we've echoed a couple of times.
Yeah. And some of you may recognize the sort of blind men and the elephant, everybody describing a different part of the elephant that they see. And you might have a very different description of this animal or object based on each one of those, feeling a tusk or a trunk or, the backside or whatever. So kind of a similar thing going on with some of these, as these different sources attempt to detect and observe and report on techniques. So one of the reasons that identifying top techniques, whether that's most reported or most frequent, is for a threat-informed defense, or prioritizing those so that we can figure out what we want to do about the techniques that are most relevant to us. And MITRE provides a nifty way of doing this. For every technique that's in there, there's a set of mitigations. There's the question of which mitigation is most effective for that technique, or how effective is it? Don't have any answers to that. But just the fact that we can line them up, I think, is an interesting exercise, and we start to see that, all right, we can identify, let's just assume this is my techniques that I'm most concerned about because that's the consensus most frequent or whatever, but I can narrow those down. I get a list of mitigations that are also prioritized based on the frequency of those techniques. And maybe behavior prevention on endpoint is not my number one, but it's something to consider, right? Maybe I already have that. I can tick that off the box and look for something else. Maybe that's something that we do need to fit into the budget cycle or start thinking about, and so on and so forth. And the cool thing that I think about, like to point out here, is that many of these mitigations address multiple of your top techniques, right? And therefore those might be places to start. And some of these things you almost get for free. You might do one of these mitigations because it's strongly attached to a particular technique, but you get kind of 2 other techniques that it addresses kind of for free. And anytime you can get that kind of stuff in building a defense, that makes the defense stronger, and it's ultimately a win for defenders. So Frank, I know a lot of this hits very close to home for you. So I'll let you have some time to share thoughts on this, or next slide if you want to go there.
You can go to the next slide to help kind of contextualize it, and we definitely don't want to go too far down the vendor approach, but I think it's important to realize something that Wade said earlier, which is trying to contextualize all this, right? We're giving you a lot of, here's the most frequent, here's the most reported, how do you prioritize those, how do you understand against how they relate to any given threat? And I think it's important to realize that not all the techniques you have to care about. And something that I even said earlier was, like, you don't even have to care about all the tactics in the same way, let alone the techniques in the same way, right? The opportunity to defend differs whether you're on execution or whether you're on crit access or whether you're looking at discovery. You kind of have to take this holistic approach of understanding what threats you need to care about, then prioritize the techniques that those threats are using, and then layer in your defenses. Because to the prior slide with the Sankey diagram, right, it's not just about which mitigation, it's about which mitigations. It's about what is your detection capability on top of that. Where's your logging capability? Understanding how your entire defensive stack aligns to the threats that you care about. And that's really where threat-informed defense is trying to come into play. This, you're going to ignore all the words on the screen here and read about it in the report, but really what it's all about is trying to say, these are the threats I care about. This is how much I care about any of those threats. These are the defenses I have. What's my risk posture? Have I done enough for those most important techniques? Have I done all I can? Maybe logging is all you can do, but make that some assumption that is now known and defined, and that is what you're doing, and that is okay, and you've accepted the rest of the risk, because from a defensive standpoint, that's all you can do, right? But it's being able to make those really informed decisions, how to prioritize, how to look at things. And I hope that that's where the data that we release here comes into play. It helps you prioritize, helps try to say, okay, care about these other things maybe more than these other things, so that you can start getting ahead. Because one of the common challenges we always heard at Attack, and when I was working at MITRE, was like, okay, well, where do I start, right? Attack is a great framework. It's easy for people to buy into it. Yeah, go after things that bad guys do, right? There's no really foil to that, right? That's what people want to do. But the how to prioritize which ones is the harder part. And then when you say, okay, yeah, I'm done, at least for now. And I think that's really where this has to come into play. Understanding how important is any given technique, and then what you have defensively. And then go into the next slide for a second there,
Yeah.
Wade. And so this is just another foil, just to kind of say, hey, when you start looking at these techniques, for instance, this account discovery, which was one of the ones that was the top, I think it was the top
that might have
frequent
been
one, if I recall.
number one overall by frequency. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can understand it's not just about understanding which mitigations are in place, but what other solutions you have, what tests could you run, or detections could you make, what logging capability you have. And that's something that, again, we're trying to help people think about that, right? Not just say, here's what adversaries do, not even say these are the important techniques to do, but this is what you could do about this technique. These are the 12 sigma rules that you could go after. These are the 3 data sources you should have that could collect the data required to cover this. Pull in all this information from the open source world, from vendors that are providing it to us, and trying to give that to the community so you can make better threat-informed decisions. And so that's how we're using this data and how we're pulling this data in, and really trying to help the community move forward with it.
Excellent. So just a couple quick points here that I want to hit as we close, because I think maybe some of the people that are attending this or that will watch this recording are responsible for putting together reports like those we use as sources in this study. So wanted to share a little bit of the challenges that we encountered so that we can all collectively improve the usability of the information that is out there in all of our reports. One challenge we had, which I think is less now, is the pace and scope of attack updates. We have a chart in the report that, early on those were lots of changes, and if you can kind of think what's going on, I collect information according to some early version and report that, and then someone else uses it. It gets really hard to compare across different sources and across time when there's lots of churn in attack techniques. So like I said, that's settled down a little bit, but that was a challenge in the time span of this study. Tactic technique ambiguity is a big one. Frank mentioned this a while ago, but there are many techniques in attack that fit under multiple tactics. And most of the time, sources are only reporting the technique. They're not reporting that I saw this technique associated with, this tactic. So sort of linking those together, if that's possible in your reporting, would help people that are trying to make use of it and do things like we're trying to do here, so that we don't have to make assumption that, okay, when you report valid accounts, that's probably in initial access. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The scarcity and inconsistency in reporting of sub-techniques is something that we have mentioned. Again, that might be because you're not collecting at the sub-technique level. It might be because it's very detailed, and when you write a report on that, you're speaking to an audience that doesn't care about those details, and so you kind of roll up to the technique level. I get it. But just realize that does have an impact on the specificity and usability of those results by defenders to create a threat-informed defense. If you subscribe, as I do, as Frank does, that specificity can help you make better decisions and kind of narrow in on controls better than the technique level. So, and then number 4 here, I think, was super interesting and just a challenge for us all. We didn't find any sources that reported techniques specific to mobile devices. We found one specific to industrial control systems, right? So if you are trying to prioritize attack techniques for either of those sort of environments, you're going to struggle with finding intel and data out there to help you with that. Very, very little comparison of techniques across organizations of different sizes. We found one source that compared techniques specific to different regions around the globe, and then 2 sources that reported techniques and did some comparisons by industries or different sectors. And of course, I think this is a big area of improvement where the reporting can go into some of these areas, and that, I would assume that for lots of these different segments that you might see a different frequency ranked top 10, and that might be useful to the people within those segments. So that's something to consider as you are potentially preparing reports like this as well.
Yeah, I think
Frank, anything to add?
Yeah, I think the one thing is part of the what we validated through this study was, right, this is something that really needs to be continually done. And to that effect, what we're hoping is that by doing a little bit of this call to action on how to improve when this happens next year, or whenever it happens next, that becomes something that the data is of a quality that will allow us to do a lot more racking and stacking analysis. Because again, threat informed defense inherits the principle that not every organization should care about the same threats.
Yeah.
Maybe certain techniques should be more important than other ones, but which threats are using them, which threats are going after them, comes into play. And so if we don't have the visibility into the techniques by organization size, region, industry, right, we don't have that visibility. I think the other thing to point out would be when it comes to platforms, especially like ICS and mobile, right, they're just typically underreported in general.
Yeah.
Whether that's a lack of visibility, a lack of sharing, I'm not here to say, but I think that that's one where attack has had the same challenge in terms of how they've been able to update and the limitations that they face in terms of updating those frameworks. And it's because there just isn't enough data. Fortunately, enterprise is very robust. Cloud, which sits underneath enterprise, is growing in terms of the reporting. But the more reporting that there is, the more open reporting there is, the more transparency around where the data is coming from, really allows people to make more use of the data. And so the thing that we would like to see is definitely not to preach to the people that are providing good data, is make it great, make it something that's more usable. And hopefully future studies of this only become more impactful in terms of really being able to rack and stack the prioritization.
Yep. And cloud on here is one that we didn't mention. There were 2 or 3 sources that broke things out by either on-prem versus cloud, or even different cloud environments. But that's certainly another one that I think is more commonly reported than, say, mobile devices or ICS, but not typically differentiated in these reports. Now, it may be a cloud native telemetry provider that's offering those results, but sort of not the, okay, here's what we saw in this environment versus this environment, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I'd expect that to only be amplified, frankly, and in the next version of this report, from the standpoint that if you look over the last year, 2 years, right, there's been really this emergence of XDR. And one of the big values of XDR, not to get into that whole debate, is the fusion of endpoint and network and cloud into one repository, and being able to look across that. And so I think you will start seeing more and more cloud coming into play across all these sources, not to mention just as an attack vector, it's there already.
All right. So I have not been monitoring Q&A. I've seen some chat stuff. That was the window I had, but I hear that the Q&A has been hopping. So hopefully had your questions answered. If you didn't, we'll save those, and we will be addressing those, social media, blog posts, or other things like that. Let me see. I think we probably should wind it down here. If, like I said, you will get a link to download the report when we conclude here, and we will have a replay of this webinar. And we'd love to hear about this. I mean, this is something that we plan to do in the future. I don't know if this is going to be an annual thing that we try to do. Some of that is going to depend on sponsorship and interest and data providers and all of those kinds of things. But if you view this as valuable, we'd love to hear about it, and we'd love to hear how we can make it more valuable in the next iteration of this that we do. That's what we're all about, is doing research that is of value to you. So having your input on that helps a ton. And I'll just say, hey, thanks for joining up. I know days are busy, and the fact that you spent almost an hour here with us is much appreciated. Frank, thank you as well. Got any parting words of wisdom for the crowd here?
No, I just want to thank the Scientia team for putting this together. Right, it was a post as we were reminiscing that been over a year. Right, one of the initial things was Wade trying to push the community to doing one of these types of studies, and we were happy to be involved with it. And really think that as a community, we need to start answering these problems together, because again, everybody's got their own perspective, but if we put all the perspectives together, we get a better picture. And so really encourage everyone to be on the lookout for future studies like this through Scientia, and contribute and help really push the community forward.
Wonderful. Hey, appreciate it, everyone. We'll be around. Love to hear from you about this. Take care.
Thank you.